Good evening, everyone, and welcome to PCGMC, and the first of two presentations. Yes, two still counts as a series. Two presentations on Israel. From some of the comments I was getting as I met you all coming in, I was getting the impression that some of you thought that tonight was going to be kind of a how I spent my summer vacation report. It's not exactly that. It's a little bit more, shall we say, informative, formal, and prepared. However, it is, as you no doubt have already surmised, geared more toward prepping you for what you could see on your summer vacation, and what an immersion into the archaeology and the lived spaces of Galilee and Judea could do for your own imagination of the ministry of Jesus and the birth of the church in these spaces. Yes, some Old Testament stuff too, but I'm a New Testament professor, so I'm not going to get into that. Oh, well. So, and if anyone is interested, the brochures for our Israel tour have arrived. They're on the back table there by the organ speakers. If you want to see what the itinerary looks like, this is now scheduled for May 19th, 2025. To some date when we get back. I didn't look. So, without further ado, let us pray and begin. Almighty and gracious God, we give you thanks for every opportunity that you give us to come together in your presence and in the presence of our sisters and brothers. And we thank you for your gift of Jesus Christ and for the incredible miracle of the incarnation, how the Word, your Son, took on flesh, but not just any flesh. He took on the flesh of an early first century Galilean Jew. And we pray, Lord, as we think about that context into which he was born and in which he lived and ministered, you would inspire our imaginations to think more informedly and carefully about the Gospels, about the stories that we know so well, but that happened in a land and a time so far from us. So use this evening, and we give you thanks again in Jesus' name. Amen. When we think of Galilee, we most likely think first about the Sea of Galilee and the villages that line its coasts. So much of the action of the Gospels that occurs in Galilee occurs on or around this large lake. The region of Galilee was itself much bigger than the Sea of Galilee and its coasts. It stretched at least 15 miles to the north, 15 miles to the south, and about 25 miles to the west of the center of this Sea of Galilee. It took a full day to walk from the coast of the Sea of Galilee to Nazareth, an 18-mile walk. So I shouldn't assume a full day. It could be like 3. But Galilee was big. But apart from the villages of Nazareth and Cana, it is really the Sea of Galilee that dominates the set, as it were, of Jesus' activity in this region. And among all the villages around the Sea of Galilee, Capernaum stands out as the one most often singled out as the specific location of one of Jesus' actions or teachings. And in the Gospel of Matthew, we are told that after his baptism and his temptation, Jesus, quote, made his home in Capernaum by the sea, in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali. It became his own town, as we hear again later in the same gospel. Because of the archaeological work that has been done at Capernaum, it is indeed a highlight not only of the Gospels, but also of the region of Galilee today for people interested in the context of Jesus' life and ministry. though in all fairness, the site of Magdala has become a close competitor. Nevertheless, what we can see in Capernaum invites us to think about a number of the realities that dominated the time, energy, and the lived spaces of the people to whom Jesus went out to proclaim that the time is fulfilled, the kingdom of God is at hand. These include the institution of the synagogue, the residences of the majority of the people who lived at this time, and some of the basics of the economy that occupied and sustained, if only barely, the people of Galilee's villages. Galilee had an earlier life as part of the kingdom of Israel, the kingdom of the northern tribes of Israel that seceded from the union, as it were, after the death of King Solomon, leaving the tribes of Judah and Benjamin on their own as the kingdom of Judah. In 722 BC, Shalmaneser V of the Assyrian Empire brought an end to that northern kingdom of Israel, after which Galilee appears to have been left largely depopulated for several centuries. Parts of it were no doubt farmed during the Babylonian and the Persian periods for the benefit of the coastal cities and the foreign overlords, but there doesn't appear to have been any effort to colonize the region. After Alexander the Great's empire breaks up into the kingdoms of his successors, we've fast-forwarded to about 331 BC. Wrong, 323 BC. The Ptolemaic Empire of Egypt, the Seleucid Empire of Syria begin to colonize this region, particularly planting military colonies of their veterans and their soldiers as they jockey for position against each other. The ongoing struggles between those two kingdoms, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, and then the rivals that erode both of these kingdoms from within, prevent lasting investment in colonizing Galilee, so it remains sparsely populated. Between 167 and 141 BC, a Judean priest named Judas Maccabeus and his brothers lead a successful revolution against Seleucid rule and make Judea a free and independent state again for the first time in 440 years. Under their descendants, the high priestly kings of the Hasmonean dynasty, the Judeans begin to aggressively colonize Galilee, reclaiming it as part of their ancestral heritage as Israelites, as they also did in regard to Samaria and the regions east of the Jordan River. So from the late 2nd century BC on, we begin to find new settlements throughout Galilee, and to find at these settlements the same telltale signs of Jewish occupation that we find throughout Judea to the south. We find household vessels carved out of limestone or chalk, bearing witness to a shared interest in ritual purity, because stone, unlike clay and pottery, was considered incapable of being rendered ritually impure. We hear about such vessels in John chapter 2, when Denville preached about the turning of water into wine at the wedding of Cana, limestone vessels for the rites of purification. We also find ritual immersion pools. In the singular, it's called a mikvah. If there's a bunch of them, they're called mikvayot. We find ritual immersion pools, mikvayot, in the wealthier homes like this priestly home in the town of Magdala on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. And we also see mikvayot like this near installations of olive oil production and wine production, again bearing witness to a desire to follow the laws for removing pollution. Laid down in Leviticus, you immerse yourself to remove pollution before you make wine and oil, so that you don't then sell richly polluted wine and oil to everybody in Galilee and Judea. We also find ossuaries, bone boxes, for the collection and permanent storage of a deceased person's bones after the flesh has decayed, just as one finds throughout the first-century tombs in Judea. And one is hard-pressed, wherever one goes, to find pig bones anywhere, suggesting adherence to the dietary laws laid down in the law of Moses. For those of you who are reading the Bible through a year, I bet that was a fun week. Yeah. Of course, there is also a near absence of pagan cultic sites in the region from the late 2nd century BC on. Indeed, this shared material culture suggests that many Galileans were descended from Judean settlers from the period of Hasmonean expansion, and that they continued to prioritize local Jewish identity and the practices of ritual purity that helped to underscore that distinctive identity. By all accounts, they remained closely attached to the temple in Jerusalem. They participated in the pilgrimage festivals of Passover, Pentecost, and booths, and they flocked to the temple's defense when it was threatened with desecration, as, for example, happened dramatically under Caligula around 40 or 41 AD. That Hasmonean dynasty succumbed to civil war between 67 and 63 BC as two brothers whose names appear on the following slide. Thank you. As two brothers, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, became rivals for the throne of their father. And these two rivals made the mistake of appealing to Pompey the Great, the Roman general present in the East in 63 BC. They appealed to him to intervene and settle the matter. Well, when Rome sticks its nose under the tent, it never leaves. Pompey chose Hyrcanus, the older of the two brothers, who did have the more legitimate claim, but who was also decidedly less popular. However, Hyrcanus became even more unpopular when it was clear that a foreign government was supporting his rule, and so Aristobulus was always able to rally together an army, or his sons were able to rally together armies to try to take back the throne of Jerusalem. And what that ended up doing was simply ravage Galilee as Roman armies, as the armies of Hyrcanus, eventually the armies of Herod the Great, met these revolutionary groups, slaughtered them, mayhem, destruction. Galilee suffered more than its share during this period. Think about what it's like to have an agricultural economy. I can't imagine, because my whole experience of agriculture is yard work. However, I'm told that in pre-industrial societies, it's a tenuous business, and one lost growing season can mean havoc for a family. It can mean financial instability, even financial mayhem for a family. As Galilee goes through these decades, a lot of crops are lost. A lot of families are impoverished. A lot of people lose their land. And a lot of wealthy people pick up that land. And so we have a lot of dispossession and greater instability. It was about this time and into this situation that Jesus was born. The Roman Emperor Augustus, with whom Herod the Great was on very friendly terms for most of Herod's life, honored the arrangements of Herod's will and divided Herod's kingdom between Herod's three oldest surviving sons. Yes, that was a dysfunctional family. The oldest three sons were not surviving sons. The lion's share of the kingdom, Judea, Samaria, and Idumea, a region even further south than Judea, went to Herod's oldest surviving son, Archelaus. We hear about this Archelaus in Matthew chapter 2. After bringing Mary and Jesus back from Egypt, Joseph avoids settling in Judea because Archelaus already has a bad reputation. Archelaus will be removed from power by Augustus just 10 years later, and all of his territory would come under direct Roman administration. The northeastern quarter of Herod's kingdom, mostly occupied by non-Jews, would go to Herod's third oldest surviving son, Philip, who would rule it peacefully and by all accounts well and justly for 40 years. Galilee and another area east of the Jordan called Perea would go to Herod's second oldest surviving son, Antipas. This is the best known Herod of the Gospels, the one who has John beheaded and the one who is part of Jesus' hearings in Luke chapter 23. Archelaus was an ethnarch. Antipas and Philip were tetrarchs. You might have come across that term in the Gospels, Herod the Tetrarch. It really means the ruler of a quarter of a region. Tetra, quarter. Coins minted in Galilee by Antipas reflect this title very clearly. That is to say, very clearly if you can read Greek. Not so clearly otherwise, sorry. I think it must have been particularly difficult for Antipas to accept the disposition of Herod's will, because in Herod's second to last will, Antipas got the whole realm to himself. So I can only imagine how disgruntled Antipas was for years with his second-rate, quarter-sized kingdom of Galilee and Perea. Notice, on this coin, there are no images of animals, heads of emperors, heads of state, or what have you. Like his father, Herod the Great, Antipas respected the second commandment, and he did not parade images of people or animals in any of his artwork, including his coins, because he ruled over a Jewish realm, and he wanted to rule them as unprovocatively as possible. Philip's coins were different. They have heads of emperors, heads of Augustus's wife Livia, even on the small bronze coins, because he's so humble, Philip's own head. But he rules a largely Gentile realm, so that's the norm there. Rome used these client kings, first Herod the Great, then his sons, to secure Rome's interests. They used client kings throughout the eastern part of the empire so that they could take on less direct responsibility themselves and thus less expense and less trouble for those regions. Antipas was responsible for maintaining his own military force, enough for internal policing and to serve as a bulwark against possible aggression from an enemy from outside. In Antipas' case, this enemy would be the Nabatean kingdom, whose territory adjoined Perea, his other territory east of the Jordan. You might remember that Antipas divorced his wife in order to marry Herodias, who had likewise divorced her husband, who was another son of Herod the Great, but a private citizen. But Herodias wanted to trade up to marry a tetrarch. Well, Antipas's first wife was actually the daughter of the Nabatean king. So a neighboring power that used to be an ally quickly became an enemy for Antipas. So when we think of the centurion in Luke chapter 7, who is stationed in Capernaum, right there on a border town of Antipas's realm, we shouldn't think of a Roman centurion, because Rome put Antipas there so Rome wouldn't have to invest its own military in that region. This was an officer in Antipas's own sort of military police. Capernaum, let's have that small map. Capernaum, I wonder if you can see it. It's very small. It's at 12 o'clock. Capernaum is at 12 o'clock on the Sea of Galilee, and you can see it's almost to the edge of the coral-colored region. I would have said pink, but I'm trying to get more precise with my color shading. So the centurion is there as probably part of a border guard, and we encounter Matthew there. Matthew sitting at the receipt of customs, as the KJV quaintly puts it. A tax collector, a duty collector, a customs official, is in Capernaum because it is a border town. So goods coming into Antipas's realm from Philip's or from the Decapolis, the orange area below the green, would be paying a hefty duty to import their goods. And of course, those who are exporting goods would also pay an export tax at that desk. This still makes a person like Matthew very unpopular because it makes imported goods impossible for any normal person to afford, because the price goes up by about 25% every time those goods cross a border. So for most people, buy local is a necessity and not just a philosophy. All right, let's move on to the synagogue. Many of the villages throughout Galilee would have been quite small. Think a population of 300 to 400 people for a village like Nazareth. Capernaum was large for a village. Population estimates based on acreage and likely density of occupation suggest a figure around 1,200. The most distinctive ancient structure visible in Capernaum today is its synagogue. This was likely true in the first century as well, though the synagogue that we could see if we visited today is a synagogue from the late Roman period. Think 4th or 5th century A.D. This structure stands out all the more in the present-day site of Capernaum because it's the only building made from this bright pinkish limestone in the midst of a sea of black basalt houses, because basalt is everywhere. You scrape off an inch of dirt, you find basalt. Basalt is everywhere. It's the number one building material in all of Galilee. The limestone has to be imported, so you only use it for very special buildings. The synagogue of the first century was much smaller and likely far less ornate. In fact, probes underneath this beautiful floor here. Archaeologists can only go down so far. You find something this beautiful, you say, all right, we're going to take that. We're going to stick with that. We're not going to remove this synagogue to see the paltry first century synagogue's foundations underneath. But they did remove some flagstones to see what was under, and they found in the middle of this synagogue a large black basalt floor, which probably represents the floor of the first century synagogue that this overbuilt. On the two aisles of the synagogue, under the two aisles of the synagogue, they found what looked like more residential areas. So they know the first century synagogue was pretty small. However, this is what happens when I get off script. Oy, don't get off script. So, there was an intermediate phase of building, a larger basalt one. If we go to the next slide, if you look at the side of this synagogue, you can see that the limestone blocks rest on a black foundation for part of the synagogue building. So somewhere in the 3rd or 4th century, there was an expansion of the smaller 1st century synagogue. This is touted as the first century synagogue, but that's almost impossible. This is probably the black part. The black part is probably the foundation wall of a 3rd or 4th century expansion. So in Jesus' day, it was smaller. By the late 1st century BC, so even before Jesus was born, the synagogue had become an important, pervasive institution throughout Judea and Galilee. The synagogue, as an institution, seems to have its origins outside of the land of Israel, in the so-called diaspora, those communities of Jews who have by this point lived for centuries in Egypt, or in Antioch of Syria, or in Asia Minor, or in the region of the old Babylonian Empire. For example, in Egypt, inscriptions reveal houses of prayer, Jewish houses of prayer from the 3rd century BC, as places that Jews would gather for the expression of their common devotion. And these houses of prayer quickly grew to serve a much wider variety of functions as sort of a community center where law cases could be heard, where contracts, wills, marriage documents could be drawn up, where a corpse could be laid out for a time of mourning before burial, and where the community could gather to discuss any matters of community concern. The shift in terminology from prayer house to synagogue, think gathering or gathering place, may reflect the acknowledgement of this broader range of purposes that this building came to house. Synagogues were, of course, places for the reading of the Torah, the study of the Torah and the other scriptures. This is directly reflected in the Gospels, where we read of Jesus' teaching ministry throughout Galilee, generally on Sabbaths. It was the natural place for the majority of Jews to gain that level of familiarity with their laws, about which Jewish authors like Philo or Josephus were proud, boasting on behalf of their nation. We're a people who knows our ancestral traditions. We can't be certain what a service of prayer and study in a 1st century synagogue could look like. We have some descriptions in a late 2nd, early 3rd century document called the Mishnah. If you think Leviticus is fun reading, you should try the Mishnah. It's a codification of Jewish legal opinions that was committed to writing around 200 AD. According to this source, the liturgy started with a recitation of the Shema, the fundamental faith statement of the Jewish people. It begins with the declaration, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You will love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might." It was followed by a series of prayers known as the 18 benedictions. There were 18 of them by 200 AD. There were probably fewer in Jesus' time. These prayers cultivate an awareness that God is merciful toward God's people, pardoning their iniquities, healing their infirmities, providing for them in this life through provision of food and safety, providing for them in death through the hope of resurrection. These prayers also reinforced the conviction that God was in some sense the special God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the defender of their descendants, the people of Israel. These prayers also orient the worshipers in a decidedly nationalistic direction, nurturing a longing for the land of Israel, the glorification of Jerusalem, the restoration of native leadership as opposed to domination by Gentile overlords, and the regathering of the Jews living outside the land. These prayers were likely then followed by a reading of some substantial portion of the Torah, think 2 or 3 chapters, followed by perhaps a homily based on them, and broader discussion among the gathered assembly about that text. And the whole likely closed with some sort of benediction. And if it did, it would have been the priestly benediction known from Numbers 24. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you, etc. Despite the common claim that women were seated in a separate section in synagogues during the Roman period, there is no archaeological or ancient literary evidence to support that. Can we get closer than Capernaum's beautiful limestone 4th century synagogue to the kind of synagogue that Jesus would have frequented in order to teach, to heal, admittedly also to stir things up? Yes, if we leave Capernaum and travel to the sites of some nearby towns, if we walk just 6 miles west from Capernaum along the shore of the Sea of Galilee, don't worry, we won't actually walk if you come next May. But if we walk 6 miles, we come to the larger village of Magdala, an important center for the fishing industry of the region. Here in Magdala, we can see the entire floor and a few feet of the walls of a bona fide 1st century synagogue. We know this because this area was disturbed by efforts to fortify Magdala during the first Jewish revolt, which hit Galilee in 66 and 67 AD, after which this part of Magdala lay derelict. So it's a wonderful time capsule of a pre-70 AD Jewish synagogue. The large gathering room toward the back has a depressed central area surrounded on all sides with a row of benches, then another tier with another fully surrounding row of benches. So all the focus is toward the center of the room where the scriptures would be read and the discussion would be launched by a homily. We could reinvigorate that tradition. You could give a sermon and then we could all, just talk about it. Wouldn't that be interesting? Things would be longer, so forget it. Okay, the floor was decorated with black and white mosaics featuring geometric patterns, no images of animals or humans, but just nice geometric patterns in keeping with the second commandment. And the walls show that they have been frescoed. They've been plastered and then frescoed in a style that you could also see at Pompeii, the simplest, most basic architectural style that you see there, sort of red and yellow squares imitating masonry. These are all signs that there were wealthy patrons of this local synagogue and that they took pride in the adornment of this important common building, because mosaics and frescoes cost a lot of denarii. When we read that Jesus traveled throughout Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and driving out demons, it seems highly likely that he would have done so here in Magdala as well, a major town just 6 miles from Capernaum, and of course celebrated as the native town of Mary of Magdala, Mary Magdalene. If we were to walk 10 miles east from Capernaum into the Golan Hills, which we surely would not do, because some of that area still has mines in it, we would come to the fortified town of Gamla, another perfect time capsule from 68 AD, the year the Romans besieged this town and killed the majority of its inhabitants. One of the points at which the Romans breached the fortification wall is still visible today. The site was never resettled, although a lot of its building materials were recycled over the years. That is the scourge of archaeological sites, recycling. Oh, look, a pile of perfectly carved masonry blocks. Grab them! And there goes a synagogue. Nevertheless, the remnants of a synagogue here have a footprint very similar to the one that we could see at Magdala and to other first century synagogues that have been uncovered. For example, makeshift synagogues made by revolutionaries at the fortress of Masada and the fortress of Herodion during the Great Revolt of 66 to 70. The footprint here, one larger open central space and multiple rows of benches surrounding the outside perimeter, is really the more common layout than the one we just saw in Magdala. There was also a study room attached to this synagogue, a smaller room fitted with benches around the perimeter for obviously a smaller group to come together for Torah study during the week. The synagogue in Magdala also had one of those. I didn't point it out on the photo. That seems to be more and more a common feature of these synagogues. Ritual immersion pools, mikvayot, and here's a large one. It's kind of hard to see, but there's a stairway on your left, looking at the photo, to go down into this pool of water. Ritual immersion pools like this one at Gamla are frequently found adjacent to synagogues, reminiscent of the same kind of installations found all around the temple in Jerusalem, which we'll talk about in September. This might reflect merely a concern for safeguarding the ritual purities of others as we all gather together in the synagogue on a Sabbath. It might also indicate that those who attended the regular prayer and study in the synagogue were aware that they were preparing for an encounter with the Holy One, and doing so in a manner analogous to how they would prepare to enter the precincts of the temple in Jerusalem. A second prominent feature of the Capernaum site is the partially reconstructed residential blocks surrounding the synagogue on 3 of its sides. The walls of the residences are made of the basalt blocks that are everywhere to be had in Galilee, far more readily available than wood. The most celebrated of these residential blocks is the residence identified as early as the late 1st century as the House of Peter, around which an octagonal church has been built. You can see 2 of the perimeter walls of the octagonal church had been built by the 4th century, which ended up obscuring any sense of what the house underneath looked like. Now, if you come with us in May, you'll find out that I'm not a big fan of traditional sites. Like, oh, this is where Jesus fed the 5,000. It's like, well, this is one hill where he might have fed the 5,000. Look, there are hills everywhere.
I'm more nostalgic, so I like those.
So we're going to break up into 2 groups. The touchy-feely group. We'll go with Denville. No, but the House of St. Peter has a really strong claim to credibility. Already, by the late 1st century, it was a site that was venerated by other Christians as the house that Jesus stayed in, as Peter's house. The room in the center of this house was already coated with plaster in the 1st century. You know it's coated with plaster in the 1st century because people end up dropping coins or other such artifacts in the plaster. And when you find them stuck in the plaster, you know, you have a date for when that was done. And there was Christian graffiti in this plaster. So already very early, Christians are coming here and remembering this is where it all started. That's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. Where was I?
Nice church on top of it.
And there's this big whopper of a church on top of it.
It's a flying saucer.
Like the synagogue, the layout of the residences throughout these blocks reflects a later stage of occupation, likely the 5th century AD, not the 1st century state of affairs. But two factors suggest that when we look at these residential blocks, we're looking at something very analogous to what we could have seen here in the first century. The first of these factors is that the streets and the walkways, though not nearly the quality of Roman civic streets, would tend to keep the perimeters of residential blocks the same over centuries. Second, the conservative nature of village life and building techniques, because one is pretty much on one's own when it comes to renovation and expansion projects. So that reality suggests less change rather than more change over generations. The only thing that really changes with any frequency in a given block like this would be as one family expands and makes a successful bid to buy a room in another house, knocking a hole in a wall and making a door, and filling a door in the other wall and making a solid wall, so that the configuration inside the island of apartments, as it were, changes, but not the overall characteristic of these houses. That said, one can still see here traces of first century dwellings typical throughout Galilee and Judea. These tend to be small 3-room or 4-room dwellings. Think 600 square feet total. Small, right? Opening onto an open central courtyard, open to the air, which might be a common courtyard between a few dwellings, say a few dwellings occupied by an extended family. Think about Peter, Peter's wife, Peter's mother-in-law, Peter's potentially unmarried brother Andrew, other sisters or siblings who are not yet married, or if they are, making a bid and getting Herschel's apartment and knocking down a wall. So all around a common courtyard, which becomes, which becomes a place where a lot of daily activities would take place. A lot of cooking happens in these courtyards. Small gardens and vegetables are raised in these courtyards. Chickens and doves would have been raised in these courtyards, because who doesn't like chicken eggs and dove bars? Sorry. And then within the house, there would be one large room that was a multi-purpose room for cooking, dining, often sleeping. The smaller rooms would likely have been used for storage of oil, wine, and grain. And there are some stairways visible in some of these residential units that signal that there were once at least upper lofts, which might have been used for sleeping, or, if you were particularly good at making a roof, access to the roof for sleeping. Most activities, including flour grinding, weaving, and the like, would have happened in the courtyard or in that multi-purpose room. In one of these, is this the one? You can see a small clay, the base of a clay oven, which is the common kind of oven in first century sites. It's called a tabun, but you don't need to know that. So these clay ovens were made, and all the baking and cooking would have happened in conjunction with that. All right. Well, that was fun. Entrance to a complex like this was generally through a single door opening from the street into the courtyard. You can see that door, the leftmost side of this particular shot. The exterior walls of these residential units were generally solid for the sake of security, and the only light came in through the courtyard and through special window walls. You can see one on the rightmost side, And there should be one further on, but I have the wrong glasses to see it. A structure like this, like a bunch of staples lined up. And that would support the rest of the wall and the roof, and that allowed ventilation and light to enter the inner rooms of the house. The roof, some planks that were then covered with thatch and mud, sealed up nicely. Very cheap. Timber is not cheap or accessible, so you need to use large fronds and what have you and pack it with mud. And this is why when the four friends of the paralytic can dig through a roof, when they want to let down their friend in front of Jesus in the house, they can dig through that mud and thatch and give Peter a major headache. All right. Let's think about agriculture and industry just a little bit. Galilee's economy was like most of the Mediterranean world, agricultural. The region was amazingly fertile, as one can still see today by the presence of lush vegetation around the whole Sea of Galilee basin, and the ongoing planting of large-scale crops on a number of the hillsides. It's hard to see, but because they're camouflaged. They're under these big burlap tents to protect them from birds, but large crops. These days, more dates and bananas than the sorts of things you would have found in the first century. Grain, olives, and grapes for wine. Those were the principal crops, and they produced the most basic staples throughout the Mediterranean: bread, wine, olive oil. When you visit Capernaum, you can see one of the standard tools for processing wheat into flour. These basalt millstones, so when you think of better for him that a millstone were tied about his neck and cast into the sea, Jesus is thinking about one of these things, the Galilean precursor to cement shoes. These are industry standard throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. The top piece has an hourglass design, open to the top and the bottom. The lower piece is a cone that fits right into the bottom of the hourglass. You pour wheat into the top of the hourglass. You turn the mill. Flour, nicely coarse ground flour, comes out the bottom, and you're able to then use that to make bread. If you go to the next slide, you can see a reconstructed mill. A wooden yoke was put onto these things so you could actually turn them with relative ease, because the levers allow you to turn that heavy stone rather easily. Basalt was used because it almost never splinters, so you don't get little bits of black rock in your bread. Other stones, they found out the hard way, I'm sure, make you lose your teeth. All right. Olives were processed in 2 steps. Several examples of the stone parts of olive presses can be seen on the premises of Capernaum today. The large circular stone basin to the left of the slide and that round crushing stone sitting on top of it represent the first step in which the olives, along with their pits, are crushed to a pulp. In the next slide, you can see what a reconstructed one would have looked like. The wood doesn't last 2,000 years, so we just have the stones, but you make wooden beams and fit them into the obvious holes in the stones, and you know what to do. Very often, these would have been moved by a pack animal. A donkey or a mule can make your day so much better rather than having to push on that bar yourself. Then that crushed pulp is all gathered, placed in burlap sacks or some kind of sack, and stacked on a large stone with a circular channel carved into it, leading to a lip which leads to a collection basin. This is the stone on which this would be the olive press proper, where the oil will be expressed by a weighted lever, as in the next reconstruction. There we go. So stone weights on a beam, pile of olive pulp sacks here. The weights pull the beam down, expressing the oil from these sacks into a collection basin. If we go back to the Capernaum, we'll go forward to one more slide. One more. The stones on the right are another kind of second step expressing mechanism called a screw press. This actually wasn't developed till after Jesus' lifetime. Anyway, be that as it may. The oil was a staple food in the first century. It wasn't just what you cooked with. Breakfast might consist of a piece of bread and some olive oil for dipping. Sustain you for the morning's work. Oil was also the fuel, as you no doubt know, used in the countless lamps that have been found from the ancient world. Of course, grapes also required processing to turn them into wine, the principal drink in the ancient Mediterranean. The best, probably the nicest example of a treading floor wine press from the time of Jesus is to be found in an industrial area outside of one of Herod's palaces in Jericho, which is on the itinerary. Herod's palace is in Jericho. Not many tour groups go there. It's special. In any event, in most presses like these, grapes would be trodden underfoot in the larger basin in the rear and would be left to ferment in the sun for some time. At some point, a stopper would be removed, and the fermenting juice would be allowed to drain into a channel into the collecting basin, where it would be stored, fermented further, and become the standard drink around the entire Mediterranean. Wine was, for the record, almost never drunk straight. It was almost always watered down. And the host at a banquet, for example, would determine the ratio. 1 part wine, 2 part water? Or, what the heck, 2 parts wine, 1 part water. And of course, as a standard drink, it was basically used to disinfect water most of the time. So there it is. The same process could be used with dates. Not all around the Mediterranean, but in Judea, there were some regions that were rich with date palms. In fact, the date palm became the Roman symbol for Judea. And so date wine is produced in Jericho in presses like these. Of course, you can't trample them underfoot. You have to use heavy stones because dates are so much more robust than grapes. There were, of course, other crops. Figs, lentils, chickpeas, other protein-rich legumes. Families would often keep small gardens for vegetables and fruits. And while we're thinking about diet, think about all the small livestock kept by many families in their courtyards throughout the villages of Galilee and Judea. Chickens for eggs, occasionally, when they've been bad, for their meat. Goats for milk and cheese, and of course, wool. And around the Sea of Galilee, people had ready access to fish. Fishing was obviously an important part of the economy of the villages and towns surrounding the Sea of Galilee. And people from Galilee, Perea, and the Decapolis, if you can remember the coral, the green, and the orange regions around the Sea of Galilee, all had a piece of the industry, as it were. Capernaum is celebrated as the home of 4 apostles, at least, who came from 2 fishing families, though there is little evidence of the industry in what has been discovered of Capernaum, apart from fishhooks found in the courtyards of some of the houses. A much celebrated find from the Sea of Galilee itself is the lower part of a hull of a small first-century boat that was discovered buried in the mud close to the shoreline during a time of drought. It had to be very carefully protected Before it could be moved, the wood was like pudding. So it had to be very carefully protected before it was moved. This very boat may have been used for the purpose of fishing, and it probably would have accommodated no more than 4 fishermen and their gear when it was whole. When we go to Magdala, and Magdala is, of course, on the agenda because it's a fabulous first century site, visitors to Magdala can see the quay and the boat slips that were in use here during the first centuries BC and AD. Much of the traffic into Magdala being from fishermen, bringing their surplus hauls to this important fish processing town. I don't know, let's go back one. I don't know if you can see those boat slips, but on this line, right here, those stones jutting out with a little hole in them, those are little anchorages for small boats along the quay of Magdala. All right, thank you, Brett. The location of this quay, incidentally, shows us how much the Sea of Galilee has receded over the centuries. It's about 100 feet further away from the quay than it should be for boats to be able to dock here. An excavated block in Magdala south of the synagogue has been identified as an industrial area, one side of which sports an unusual row of square vats. While archaeologists remain uncertain, one strong proposal is that these were used to store and process fish brought in from the lake, whether by salting them or pickling them or even reducing them to garum, a fish sauce, a fish-based sauce that was the ketchup of the Roman world. I would tell you how it was produced, but then you wouldn't even try it. Whether it's salted, pickled, dried, or reduced to fish sauce, these products could then be exported to a number of the Decapolis cities, to Judea or Idumea, or beyond into the Mediterranean. This was a very important industry for Galilee. And there's one other facet of the industry to acknowledge, and that is Herod Antipas's building activity. Now, his work pales in comparison to the building activity of his father, Herod the Great, and our next session will focus on that because in Jerusalem we have so many monuments to Herod the Great's industriousness and willingness to spend unlimited sums of his subjects' money to erect marvelous buildings. Antipas had about a third of the income of his father, so his ambitions had to be tempered proportionately. However, his first project was to rebuild and expand a city called Sepphoris. Sepphoris is about 4 miles north of Nazareth. It's in the heart of Lower Galilee, halfway between the Sea of Galilee and the Mediterranean coast. It was little more than an hour's walk from Sepphoris to Nazareth, and many historians of the life of Jesus speculate that a family of masons and carpenters might have been involved in some work in nearby Sepphoris during the time of its construction, when Jesus was a teenager, say. Sepphoris had been a small fortified city for about 200 years. Visitors can still see the remains of a residential area from the 1st century BC. I'm not sure how much we're seeing of this. This is just a few stone rooms. Notice that we've moved from basalt to limestone as we've moved halfway from the Sea of Galilee toward the Mediterranean. And a number of these houses were clearly occupied by faithful Jews, even priestly families, as the next slide shows us. In the far right of that corner of that slide, you see a mikveh as part of this large residential complex. The city of Sepphoris suffered heavy damage and depopulation in the revolts that followed Herod the Great's death in 4 BC, just about the time Jesus was born. Antipas decided to rebuild it, make it his capital, and make it, as Josephus put it, the ornament of all Galilee, such as would befit a capital city. So, we saw earlier, although I didn't talk about it, a theater. Can we go back just a few slides? There it is. The remains of a theater in Sepphoris. There haven't been discoveries of other typical Roman installations in Sepphoris. The thought is it was still a pretty Judean-type settlement, even under Antipas. In the 2nd and 3rd centuries, when it became a city for veteran Roman soldiers, it would take on a completely new character. It was still very much a Jewish city in Jesus' time. Thank you, Brett. Sepphoris, however, did not satisfy Antipas for long. Within 20 years of building Sepphoris up, Antipas was breaking ground for an entirely new city where only a cemetery had sat before. His new capital would be set winsomely on the southwest shore of the Sea of Galilee and just north of some hot springs. He named it Tiberias in honor of Augustus's successor, the Emperor Tiberius. Tiberias had the fortifications of a wall and city gates. Here we can see something of those city gates and the round towers that surround the gate itself. It also had a theater. From its earliest period of occupation, only the lowermost footprint of that theater remains, because theater seats make good houses in the next century or what have you. It also reportedly had a large synagogue. Antipas was clearly trying to provide both for the Jewish citizens as well as the non-Jews who would be attracted to his cities and, of course, employed in his administration. Sepphoris and Tiberias gave Antipas an outlet for his ambitions to improve his disappointingly small realm. But these still remain very modest cities in comparison with Beit Shan to the south of the Sea of Galilee, or Caesarea by the Sea, Herod's wonder city on the Mediterranean. It's doubtful that the building activity of Antipas would have stimulated the economy of Galilee all that much. It would have, of course, helped carpenters, masons, builders, and whoever was involved in the support industry, but all of that money had to come from the rest of the people. So it was likely that these cities were built, as it were, on the backs of the agricultural workers, the normal villagers. So I'm going to skip to the end. Let's look at the Sea of Galilee again one last time. A visit to Capernaum and its neighboring towns takes us close to the everyday realities of Jesus' own life and the lives of those who heard him, followed him, and, of course, rejected him. It reminds us of the distance we need to travel in our minds to enter more fully and precisely the lived contexts of the stories that we read in the Gospels. What does it mean to enter a house? What does a house look like when Jesus goes into the house and teaches his disciples? What does a synagogue look like when Jesus goes in to read from Isaiah 61 and turn things on their head? It also helps us to feel more fully and precisely the impact that he sought to have, so that we can think more fully about the impact that these texts ought to have in our very different contexts. Capernaum, Magdala, Gamla, these places put us in touch with the synagogue and its function as an institution. They put us in touch with residential arrangements of the majority of Jesus' neighbors and the different notion of home as a place of production as well as consumption. It puts us in touch with some of the most basic features of the economy that literally put food on the table, and some of the serious inequities in the distribution of the fruits of that labor. Hopefully, in the end, it brings us closer to the Son of Man, who made Capernaum, for a season at least, his own town.